Morning, Dan and Amy. So that bite you heard at the end of the montage at the top
Yeah, who was
was
that?
Umberto Fontova, who is a Cuban author, decrying the whole D.C. press corps, President Obama, Prime Minister Trudeau. You know, Castro had an impact on people. Castro will, history will judge him for his influence. All of this kind of Orwellian vanilla speak about a brutal despot who murdered, depending on your source, CubaArchive.org has it at north of 10,000. Other estimates put it at more like 140,000 of his own people. You heard what Fontova said at the top. This, of course, in conjunction with another despot that's celebrated by the American left, another thug, Che Guevara, who is one of Castro's hatchet men, literally. And, the fascination the left has with totalitarians like Castro is, I want to say it's baffling, but it's not. There's a good piece by Paul Bonicelli from the Acton Institute at thefederalist.com, Why the Left Loves Totalitarians Like Castro. I'll let you get into. But I kind of want to, individualize this a little bit. People who actually know, people who actually lived it, to give you a different perspective than just the statistics. As Stalin said, one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. We don't want to dehumanize the victims by just treating them as statistics. One is Louis Tiant, the great major league pitcher for the Red Sox and the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
He gave an interview with ESPN yesterday. He said Cuba was the country with the most Latin American players in the majors until the regime, Castro, took over and set everything back. It's incredible. All those players that were unable to succeed, so many good ones. When I played, when I left, there were 50 or 60 players as good as me or better than me, and they could never get out. They all stayed there. That's the hardest thing, Tian continued, because everything in life must have an opportunity to be someone, to be able to do what you love, what you dreamed of as a child. That should not be taken away from anyone. That is what happened. They took away the freedom, the happiness, the dreams that one had as a boy, all you wanted to be and never could. Louis Tiant, baseball great, talking about Castro. Somebody else that's got first-person perspective on this is actually a friend of mine. He is a medical doctor here in the Chicago area. He emergency physician at North Shore University Health System, Evanston Hospital specifically. He's also a clinical associate professor at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. And he left Cuba at the age of 12 in 1961, right after the Bay of Pigs, settled with family in New York before making his way to Chicago. And he is Dr. George Del Castillo. George, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure.
So just give us, I kind of gave the quick synopsis of your background. Give us kind of a real perspective on what you experienced as a kid growing up in Cuba until you were able to get out and get to New York.
Well, it was actually a very happy existence in Cuba before Castro, notwithstanding the fact that Batista was a dictator, and the reason Castro got in was because the majority of people in Cuba wanted Batista out. So that's a fact. However, one of the funny things that I remember when Batista was portrayed in the movies, when I would go to the movies as a kid, people would yell "dwarf" about Batista, and people said, "Well, why do you say that?" It's because Batista is a dwarf compared to what Castro has done to our country. So it was just a sort of a funny anecdote at the time. When I was growing up, at age of 10, Castro came into power, and I was clearly amazed by the rapidity of the decline of the Cuban society at that time. Within 6 months, and this is historical, I mean, people actually know these facts. Within 6 months, I mean, Castro decimated the schools, confiscated the farms, the land, and then a year later, that was the agrarian reform. A year later, he started with the urban reform, where he would take properties away from people. If he had any type of property, he would confiscate that and give it to whomever was living there. So there was a cascade of events that occurred within the 2 years that I lived in Cuba after Castro came.
Well, then, Doctor, how were you and your family lucky enough to get out of Cuba?
Well, it was a very relations, as you might recall, were broken with the United States, I believe, in 1960s, and so the embassy was gone, and the Swiss embassy had taken over. So it was very, very difficult to get a visa to get out. My parents panicked because the schools were confiscated. They were indoctrinating kids at the time, and they were trying to get kids like me, who were 12 years old, to go out into the field to do the job of teaching the farmers how to read and write. And by the way, let me just take a pause here. A lot of people parrot the health and the literacy in Cuba. When I left Cuba, the literacy rate was about 80%, higher than most countries in Latin America, except maybe Argentina and Chile. And he raised it to maybe 96, 97%. The problem with that is that, as you well know, you can only read what he gave you to read, and even so, that raise of 15 percentage points or 16 percentage points meant that you could actually sign your name and maybe read a very simple text. And that was it. That was the literacy rate. Before that, the 80% was a real literacy rate of compulsory school until grade 6, I believe it was.
And the other thing that he did, as most tyrants do, is go after intellectuals or prominent families that dare to criticize the regime. They need to be eliminated, and I mean eliminated. And you had some experience with that, too.
Unfortunately, one of my very best friends who lived 2 houses away from me, his father was a prominent lawyer. Within my block, there were 3 people who were shot by Castro, and without trial. And one of the things that was amazing was, I mean, he had these kangaroo courts at the very beginning, and people were sort of accepted them because he was cleaning out the Batista regime, so to speak, although the majority of people did not like it. They did not like that beginning. But after that, there was just no trial. They just came, they got you, they put you in jail, and they either had a short trial or had no trial, and they just up against the wall, and they shot you. And this happened to my neighbor's dad.
So then were you guys in fear of losing your lives as well?
Well, yeah, no doubt. I mean, there were raids in my neighborhood. I lived in the Miramar neighborhood, which was west of Havana. It was a residential neighborhood, just like any residential neighborhood here in Chicago, Hinsdale, Wilmette, Winnetka, something like that. And they took over homes there of people that left. One of the things that I was talking to Dan one time about was when you left Cuba, they came and they would inventory your house, and they would come back before you left. In other words, you had permission to leave the country. They would inventory your house. They would come back and they would inventory the house again just to make sure that you had not sold or given some things away. And if the inventory was correct, then they allowed you to go. And as you left the house, they put a seal and a lock on the door saying this is the property of the Cuban government now. So there was no sale, there was no bill of sale, there was no right, nothing.
And as you're sort of indicating, you came from a prominent family in Cuba, but part of that, the result of that is that you were able to get out, as you said, when you were 12 years old, but your parents weren't until much later.
Yeah, my father had been a minister of public works. He was an architect. His father had been in the same position, also an architect, real estate developer, and so it was a known name. And so the government at the time, when my father wanted to get out with my mother and me, because my sister was older. My sister had left the year before with her husband, and he was 23 and she was 21, and they had a 6-month-old baby. And so my parents panicked, and they sent me to live with her right after the Bay of Pigs in New York. But they wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let my father leave for about 5 years. And this happened to many, many families. I mean, they split the families significantly, some willingly, some not.
And
So,
when your parents ultimately were able to leave, as you were suggesting, the property that your family had in Cuba, I mean, that's all gone. That's all confiscated by the government.
right. Interestingly enough, the house, our house now, I've heard is it's an office for a company that is building hotels with a French conglomerate throughout the island. And so they made it into an office building, so to speak, because they said the house, my father built the house. The house was so well built.
Have you been back to Cuba?
That's in Havana, yes. and so the house is in excellent condition, but many, many homes. I mean, it's just, Havana is so dilapidated, and there's so many people. I have friends who've gone to Cuba, and they come back, oh, the people are so nice, and it's so great, and we had so much food, and so on and so forth. And, my retort is always, well, you didn't go to the right places. There are many documentaries out there. In fact, there was one on HBO last night that showed interviews with many townspeople, if you will, who are there in Cuba who are totally disillusioned with the system. The problem is that the fear is so great that they'll throw you in prison or lose you somewhere, that people just are very, very quiet and don't say anything. I think now, because Castro is dead, maybe there'll be a little bit more open dialogue, but I don't know. I'm not terribly hopeful.
And, Doctor, have you been back to Cuba?
I went back. I went back 14 years ago because I have an uncle who died a couple of years ago at age 97, and we talked to him periodically. It was one of my only family left in Cuba, and so he was sick, and he told us on the phone, well, I'm not going to see you. I'm going to die. I'm never going to see you again. So my sister and I sort of swallowed hard and said, well, I think we should make this trip. And it was a very difficult trip. The only redeeming value of the trip was that I had family, and we were able to get together with my cousins and go around Havana and so on. But otherwise, it was a very, very sad trip, just being in a place where you grew up and you see the dilapidation, you see the poverty that was really not there before. And you see the repression that the people suffer.
Well, and you left Cuba the same year that Louis Tiant defected from Cuba, 1961, and he ends his interview on ESPN saying, I hope one day we can all go back and live in Cuba the way we used to. I guess we'll see if that's possible. Probably not until Raul Castro goes the way of Fidel, I suspect.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dan. I don't think it is a possible scenario. Certainly, the individual that they have as a successor to Raul is someone who's really not very well known at all. And the image of the revolution has died. It's not now with Castro dying, but will die, with Raul. There's no one there left except for the people in the Communist Party. And they will try and hold on like crazy because they know what awaits them. But I will tell you that there will be I don't care what people say, there will be no change in Cuba until that government changes. And I think it's a very obvious comment, but it's just not going to happen as long as someone like Raul is there with a totalitarian vice around the people's necks. It's just not going to happen.
He is Dr. Jorge del Castillo. He's a emergency physician at Evanston Hospital, North Shore University Health System, and a clinical associate professor at University of Chicago School of Medicine, and a Cuban emigre at the age of 12. George, thanks so much for joining us, sharing your story. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
He joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.